Today's presentation will be given by Yenlong, Assistant Professor of International Studies and Sociology at Indiana University in Bloomington. She's a cultural and organizational sociologist interested in the evolution of technocratic governance as a transnational institutional model and its impact on existing forms of domination and resistance. Her current book project, Side Effects, The Transnational Doing and Undoing of AIDS Politics in China, is under contract at Oxford Studies in Culture and Politics. The book stems from her dissertation that won the 2014 ASA Dissertation Award, and she was previously a postdoc fellow at the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society after obtaining her PhD at U of M in sociology and women's studies, and we're very happy to welcome her back to Ann Arbor. Today she'll be speaking on Between Blood and Sex, the contradictory impact of transnational AIDS institutions on state repression in China, 1989 to 2013. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you very much. I want to thank CCS for having me here. I would come to this talk every Tuesday when I was a graduate student. So it's really, truly an honor and delight. So today I will be speaking about how transnational institutions shape state behavior in the authoritarian context. Okay, so foreign efforts to change target government behaviors are very common in history. But in recent decades, I was taken to a different level because of dramatic expansion of governance entities at the supranational level. They distribute standards, policies, and discourses to nation state. So much of the literature has looked at to what extent and whether transnational institutions could deter national governments from using existing repressive practices. But today I will talk about how contradictory to the expectations, external interventions might actually help national governments to generate new repressive actors and means. So today's talk is motivated by a core debate in political sociology and international relations studies. Do external interventions matter at all? More specifically, I look at to what extent, by what processes, and with what consequences do external interventions affect state-society conflict. My study takes on this question in the context of HIV/AIDS. So first question, what are transnational AIDS institutions? Transnational AIDS institutions are an integrated set of discursive and organizational structures, resources, and practices regarding AIDS intervention. They are blueprints for financing, resourcing, coordinating, and implementing infectious disease control that sustains actually regular interactions across national boundaries. The major actors of transnational AIDS institutions include multilateral initiatives, intergovernmental organizations, Western governments, private foundations, international NGOs, and advocacy networks. So those organizations put infectious disease, a public health issue, on world political landscape for the first time. They also mobilize an unprecedented amount of resources to build AIDS programs around the globe. So this figure shows you the amount of external funding for AIDS programs in middle and lower income countries. So in the global south, transnational AIDS institutions have been the primary source of funding for AIDS responses. So by investing billions of dollars, transnational entities have led a large-scale institutional building project to create a very specific kind of infectious disease control in the global south. So suddenly, you have many domestic health departments are caught between this world of global health, healthcare, and then domestic organizational environment. So this really provides me an opportunity to go beyond domestic factors to look at the patterns of institutional development and political change. So my book talks about the evolution of transnational AIDS institutions and their efforts to install a very specific type of AIDS governance based on participatory democracy in China between 1979 to 2013. So this institutional building process actually informed the responses of the governments and the local communities alike, which in turn shapes the infectious disease control in China between this time period. So existing studies tend to either celebrate or refute the democratization promise of external interventions. Instead of taking either side in this debate, I reconceptualize external interventions not as a monotonic, but a multifaceted and self-contradictory process. So they did help local peoples to mobilize and push for health policy reform. However, as external interventions deepened the political participation, AIDS mobilization themselves actually created a stratified system of its own, with female sex workers on the bottom, peasants living with HIV/AIDS in the middle, and then urban gay men on the top. So eventually, democratic interventions ended up strengthening and expanding authoritarian state power. So one important goal of transnational institutions was really to promote better protection for human rights. So today's talk, I will specifically talk about how external interventions affect state repression against AIDS activism. I will limit the time frame of today's talk to 1989 to 2013. But before delving into my argument in details, I want to first introduce you to three major actors in my story: AIDS activism, state repression, and external interventions. So this photo shows you a protest of peasants living with HIV/AIDS in 2001. The banner said, "Give me back my blood, give me back my health." So when people think of HIV/AIDS, they tend to associate it with either sex or drug. But what caused the spread of this virus in China was blood. So in the 1980s, the Ministry of Health decided to develop its own plasma industry. In order to compete at the international market, it developed a very fast but dangerous procedure to collect the plasma. Given the high profits, health departments at different levels opened up their own blood banks wherever they seemed promising, remote, populous, yet poor rural areas. Local governments at the time were encouraging peasants to sell 800 cc blood for $6. In the middle 1990s, reckless collection had caused blood contamination and China's largest HIV/AIDS epidemic among peasants. The government wanted to cover up the scandal. No epidemic information was released. It caused yet another epidemic among people who were using blood and plasma products, especially women and children. So the most conservative estimate acknowledged by the state is that contaminated blood caused at least 300,000 cases of HIV/AIDS. And no government measure was taken for almost 10 years. One woman I visited lost 4 out of 6 sons during this time. So peasants started to take action. Since 2000, community activism began to evolve into larger mobilization. Not surprisingly, the government responded with escalated use of open and direct violence. Peasants were beaten, interrogated, harassed, or detained. Their activities were declared illegal, and their organizations were shut down. China's AIDS problems began to draw heightened international attention since 1999. Major organizations such as United Nations, World Bank, Western governments, international NGOs publicized blood scandals and criticized Chinese government for such violation against human rights and pressured government officials to make changes. In 2003, external interventions achieved great success. They pushed the central government to decrease the coercion against AIDS activism. At the same time, foreign organizations began to bring an explosion of material resources, technical support, and activist guidance to Chinese AIDS activists. So AIDS used to be this richest sector when it comes to mobilization. Because between 2005 and 2013, transnational AIDS programs invested about $1 billion in China, 200 million of which was used to decentralize China's health system and promote civil society actors. So the blue line here shows you a dramatic growth of AIDS activist groups, especially as other communities such as female sex workers and urban gay men were joining the peasants. So if the narrative was to end right here, we would say this is a relatively success story of transnational mobilization, just as those being described by political scientists such as Margaret Keck and Catherine Sinkink. But is this the whole story? So today I'm going to talk about how, contradictory to theoretical expectations, external intervention did not simply decrease coercion. Instead, since 2003, the engagement with transnational entities actually facilitated what I call diplomatic repression, which means adopting democratic templates and resources to repress without publicly violating transnational rules. So government agents developed new covert and indirect methods, such as new forms of electronic and physical surveillance, displacing conflict, stigmatization, use of informants, and cooptation at not only the domestic, but also transnational level. Diplomatic repression broke up activist coalition and really contributed to the decline of AIDS activism since 2010. But at the same time, UN officers were praising China for, quote, sharpening the focus on human rights in the national response to AIDS, quote. China has also become a powerful actor in global health governance along with Brazil and Russia. It also began to export AIDS programs to Africa. So the question is, where did innovative repressive practices come from in the face of external challenges? Recently, the impact of transnational institutions on state repression has gained a lot of attention in political science and sociology. Scholars have largely adopted what I call a punitive model. So the punitive model has concentrated on how transnational institutions could pressure national governments and correct their behavior and decrease the level of repression. This model has two approaches. The realism approach focuses more on political pressure, military and economic sanction. Constructivist approach, on the other hand, focus on public naming, shaming, socialization of national governments. So they tend not to question the state's motive and the methods to eliminating challenges. It's all about whether the state can afford to repress or not. So by affecting the state's access to power, money, and reputation, external interventions could potentially change state behavior and affect state repression in quantity. This model definitely explains why China decreased coercion after external interventions against AIDS activism, but it cannot predict what happened next. My constitutive model shifts attention from the quantitative level to the types and the forms of repression. The punitive model has concentrated so much on the macro level factors. There is a near absence of actors or agency in existing literature. But the fact is, political regimes don't repress. Organizations and the people who run those organizations do. So by using the institutional theory, the constitutive model studies the meso-level process that transmit transnational codes to national governments, organizations, and shape their incentives and action. So the outcomes are much more diverse than simply the quantitative change of repression. So my model has three major components. First, government organizations are not simply passive targets of intervention. Rather, they're creative agents, and they have to decide what external demands actually entail and decide how they can respond accordingly. Second, the state is not just a totality. It is constituted of different policy domains that operates more or less autonomously. Okay, so it's when you think about the health, labor, environment, even though the domestic and national political structure does matter. However, government organizations tend to make their decision on how they respond to activism based on where and which policy domains they belong to. Thirdly, the disruptive effects of external interventions are not evenly distributed. When they create changes in certain policy domains, they might not only just constrain, but also generate new resources, networks, and the modes of actions that government agents could utilize to generate new repressive action. Therefore, it is really the specific interactions between transnational institutions and your government agency that shapes the impact of external interventions. So applying the constitutive model, I argue that external interventions do not simply affect repression in quantity. They actually transformed the repression's very configuration by provoking changes in institutional rules and organizational models of AIDS governance in China. This is what I call the contradictory impact of transnational AIDS institutions. On the one hand, they attenuated the traditional coercion. On the other hand, they enabled government organizations to invent new repressive practices. So before demonstrating my argument in details, I want to first show you my data sources and methods. So between 2007 and 2013, over a course of 6 years, I had tracked China's AIDS politics development through conducting fieldwork at 3 different sites. First, transnational AIDS organizations. Second, different government organizations from health, civil affairs, foreign affairs to police and security. And thirdly, community organizations working for infected peasants, female sex workers, and gay men. This map shows you geographically where my fieldwork was conducted. Those locations were chosen based on combined factors such as epidemiology situation, community activism, and local political conditions. Today, I'm only going to present data collected in the green areas, but we can talk about other areas during Q&A. Specifically, today's talk will present you a combination of archival, ethnographic, and interview data. First, I did archival research for 3 years to establish a historical document data set. Secondly, I had worked at 2 of the major transnational AIDS organizations, United Nations Program on HIV/AIDS, UNAIDS, and the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and malaria, both at their Beijing offices, where I could observe their daily operation and their activities. I also participated in the activities of 30 community organizations in 19 villages and cities. My own identity, as well as experience of being monitored, stalked, and detained during fieldwork, has certainly shaped my data collection and analysis. In addition, I interviewed 42 government officials in 4 provinces and 94 community organizational leaders, members, and people living with HIV/AIDS. So these photos give you a snapshot of what my fieldwork site looks like. So this was a Global Fund meeting. All the presentations were given in both English and Chinese. This is Beijing government. This is where I often hang out with gay organizations. In contrast, this is the home of a rural activist. When I was visiting, it was summer, and there was a huge hill of garbage and trash next door. And I had open infected wound on my foot, which attracted a lot of flies. The whole space was covered in flies. So the smell was so overwhelming, I almost passed out after 1 hour, just staying there. That was the shortest interview I've ever done. But this is the thing, in that house, there were 3 children under 10 living here, and 2 of them were HIV positive. So the remainder of my talk would really show you that my method is not so much about the depth of each site, but really about the relations and conflicts between all these very different worlds about AIDS. So to proceed with my analysis, I will demonstrate how external interventions shape 3 attributes of external intervention, of repression. The first one is how the government diagnose or decide what kinds of specific threat activism poses. The second one is the characters of repressive agents. The third one is the repertoire of repression. So, usually from the perspective of punitive model, we tend to think of repression as something of pathology. Authoritarian regimes tend to do that just because it's authoritarian regime. But in reality, China has a very selective list of contentious issues with highest political value, designated personnel, and concentrated attention. And AIDS would not have been put on that list without external intervention. So throughout the 1990s, public health was one of China's least concern. So AIDS was categorized as, quote, a Western immoral disease, quote, caused by, quote, homosexuality, drug addiction, and premarital sex at the root, quote. Accordingly, AIDS activism was seen as something, quote, encouraging homosexuality and sympathizing with prostitutes, quote. AIDS activism was not seen as an independent political threat. It was just immoral conduct, very far away from mainstream politics. But things had changed after 2003. As my research subjects repeatedly stated, that AIDS was no longer a domestic social issue that can be isolated from sovereignty and security concern. One security official described, quote, AIDS activism is a form of Western penetration and subversion activities against the socialist regime with health as a screen, quote. So external interventions were really seen as attack on China's sovereignty. China's reaction is really nothing out of ordinary. External interventions often generate an intensified focus on sovereignty, especially in global southern countries. However, contradictory to external literature, external intervention did not provoke unified opposition from the state as a whole. My data show that government agencies actually had widely different and sometimes conflicting experiences with the politicization of HIV/AIDS. The transnational disruptive effect was really not evenly distributed, and the responses to them were not a unity, but more of a spectrum. So on the one end of the spectrum, you have the public security police or Guobao. They really wanted to eliminate any transnational influence. One officer stated, quote, we need to assume a position of hostility, quote. But others such as state security, the party international departments, foreign affairs and the civil affairs, their attitudes are much more ambiguous, or you would say, quote, neutral. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have public health departments. They really embraced transnational engagement, and they actually opened the door for transnational programs to enter into China. So why? The figure shows you the annual financial resources for AIDS programs in China. So since the 1980s, public health had been politically marginalized, and they had very little financial resources from the central government. But starting in 2003, the amount of external grants for AIDS intervention had grown dramatically, and more importantly, external pressure had forced the central government to increase its investment from $15 million in 2001, $100 million in 2004, and to $718 million in 2013. So it was transnational AIDS institutions that really granted resources and legitimacy for the bureaucratic expansion in infectious disease control. So the year of 2003 really has become a turning point for a lot of health bureaucrats' personal career. As one official said, quote, one day you woke up, money was falling from the sky, quote. Another officer bluntly told me, quote, it hardly had anything to do with the actual AIDS epidemic. We have many other important public health issues, but only AIDS is a political hotspot, quote. So they were highly motivated to embrace transnational models. However, everything came with a cost. So for a very long time, AIDS used to just be China's problem. But after 2003, the Minister of Health no longer enjoyed monopoly in this area. It was exposed to many different foreign entities. And the World Bank and the Global Fund had the biggest impact on AIDS policy development. You also have United States, World Health Organization, and Gates Foundation, who also played a critical role in this process. So during my fieldwork, you can't even go to any important meetings without the presence of foreigners, which is very rare for China. More importantly, external forces really brought community organizations into the whole framework of infectious disease control. Even though they were still far away from power center, they can no longer be simply dismissed or shut down. So ironically, as external interventions politicized the whole AIDS and amplified the dangerous threat of AIDS activism, it made it even more important for the state to repress. So instead of disregarding external demands, government organizations must find a way to balance transnational expectations for civil society participation and the domestic expectation to defend a socialist regime. So repression was even more necessary than ever, but the goal was not to kill AIDS activism, but to control it. New goals need new methods. Now let's look at how transnational AIDS institutions shaped repressive agents. In the 1990s, before external interventions, repressive agents' objectives were to eliminate all the grassroots groups and their activities. And the police and the security forces were the primary actor. So as the punitive model predicts, external interventions took place and those traditional actors were really severely criticized and their operations became constrained. However, the existing literature did not predict that the expansion of repressive agents took place after external intervention. Now it has become established as an important policy domain with the presence of transnational entities. Repressive agents must control and facilitate community activism in certain direction and in a very indirect and soft way. And the health social organizations made themselves very good candidates. Many of you probably know that health social organizations are professional associations created by the Ministry of Health to engage in social welfare service related to AIDS. They are extensions of the government into society, nationwide in scope and organized hierarchically. There are about 25 social organizations involved in AIDS programs, and Chinese Association of STD AIDS Prevention and Control and the Chinese Preventive Medicine Associations are the largest. Current government officials from the health and police departments usually double as leading officers. They usually take on the federation form and constituted of organizational members. Financial-wise, their funding is only partially provided by the government. So what about the rest? I'm going to address it in a few minutes. But overall, as you can see, social organizations don't carry any administrative ranks and power, which made them easier to be accepted by transnational audience and domestic audience. So this picture is internal documents from the Attorney General of Beijing. The title is China Must Study International NGOs. So the article introduced the concept of global civil society and stated that the emergence of non-state actors was one of the major challenges and also opportunities facing China. So accordingly, health social organizations shall be turned into transnational NGOs in order to, quote, fight NGOs with NGOs, quote. This is what I call transnationalization and NGOization. Security and police officers describe that, quote, health social organizations shall become the leader of domestic NGOs, become an important force in non-governmental diplomacy, and to get a footing in international society, quote. So it was transnational AIDS institutions that provided organizational models and resources for this transformation. Now, social organizations claim their own legitimacy as being rooted in transnational model. They conducted internal reform to mimic the structure and the management of NGOs. They set up a board of directors, steering committee, advisory groups. They designed NGO constitutions and organized annual plenary member meetings. But to learn is not simply to copy. The goal was to reformulate what they had copied and then become a new kind of transnational NGOs. In this internal speech given by the head of Standing Committee of Communist Party of Beijing, there are 6 principal strategies laid out for such a transformation. A security official explained to me what those 6 principles mean. Quote, being present and being articulate are the first step. We are not familiar with how transnational NGOs act, so we need to attend various world conferences to understand who they are, what they think, and what they do, so we can learn accordingly. Being appealing and being persuasive focus on how to channel foreigners' attention. We shall interact with transnational advocacy networks, but not getting any direct conflict with them. When they criticize us, our own social organizations need to be there to publicize our perspectives so the foreign audience can be exposed to different views and make those enemy NGOs more suspicious. The next level is being active and being important. We need to have our own social organizations established in major transnational NGO networks so we could always fight back when the state is under attack. Quote. So aside from organizational models, health departments also drew on transnational material resources to build, train, and expand health social organizations. For example, China ranked 3rd in the number of grants received from US foundations since early 2000. 10% of that money went to AIDS programs. And 2 health social organizations, Chinese Preventive Medicine Association, Chinese Association of STD and AIDS Prevention and Control, both ranked top 10 recipients. After 2009, these 2 social organizations received $20 million from US foundations. By 2013, about 80% of their operating fund came from abroad. Well, those funds were distributed in the name of promoting civil society. Now they're used for completely different purposes. So now let's look at transnational institutions, how they shape the repertoire of action. Traditionally, police and security agents mostly rely on open and direct use of violence. Those punishments tend to directly diminish community activism and to scare off potential supporters. External interventions were pretty successful in curbing this part of repertoire by 2003. But the new repertoire of action involved indirect and covert non-force to limit, preempt, or demobilize challenges and political engagement. Such action was applied far beyond China's territory, which is the key to it. So instead of eliminating activists and organizations, repressive agents adopted transnational templates and resources to disrupt the connections between community organizations. So how did it work in reality? Given the limited time, I'm only going to highlight a few examples. So starting in the late 1990s, major transnational AIDS conferences and meetings have been a major battleground for Chinese AIDS activists. This was a protest of 10 Chinese activists staged at the World AIDS Governance in 2010 in Austria. But activists were not the only one who went transnational. At the same conference, just like grassroots groups, health social organizations were distributing their flyers, praising the Chinese government for promoting civil society, projecting Chinese patients' happy life. They were also having the financial resources to stage their own section at the NGO exhibition session and organized NGO satellite meeting. Okay, so instead of rejecting rules from the outside, health social organizations actually chose to present themselves as the advocate for transnational governance model and the civil society in China. They promoted a counter model of non-political and cooperative NGOs in order to contest and marginalize the bottom-up community participation. This is everybody knows this is China's now first lady at this meeting promoting this harmonious NGO model. And at the domestic level, this model was further used to divide and conquer grassroots groups. So, okay, this is a photo taken the last time I visited the leader of the Orchid group in the hospital. So this was funded in 2005. In 2006, it was working for peasants living with HIV/AIDS. In 2008, regional health organizations reached out and offered lots of medical resources, but the Orchid group ended the working relationship 1 year later. Its leader told me that, quote, social organizations want you to remember that everything comes from the state. You get all the money and the medicine not because you deserve it or you have the right, but because of the state mercy, quote. Very soon, health social organizations supported another community organization in the same county. Since then, the Orchid group had trouble recruiting new members and applying for transnational funding. In 2013, the leader in the picture passed away and the whole group just fell apart. In contrast, Red Group. When I first visited them in 2007, it was a small group of 3 gay men working from home. But by 2012, when I visited again, they occupied a whole building with 6 offices. And in this photo, the Red Group member was showcasing their activities to a delegation of Gates Foundation. And this meeting was arranged by the China Center for Disease Control and Prevention. So Red Group was what AIDS NGOs call as star NGOs. They were manufactured by health social organizations by utilizing transnational networks and resources. One activist commented that, quote, star NGOs get more funding, more projects, more trips to attend international conferences, more opportunity to talk to foreigners and international foundations, quote. They not only helped to promote the harmonious NGO model, they also constantly attacked other more advocacy-oriented NGOs by accusing them of being unprofessional and too radical, which caused a continuous internal fight among activist groups. So most star NGOs were working with urban gay men, versus community organizations working with sex workers and peasants were often labeled as, quote, dirty, loud, uneducated, and low quality, quote. This is China's Prime Minister Li Keqiang. He was shaking hands with several community organizational leaders working with gay men. And he also ordered the Ministry of Health to pledge more funding for them. So this lady in the picture was a UN representative in China, UNICEF. So she commented, quote, it was heartening to see an open discussion between the government and civil society groups representing the needs, quote. However, the day after this meeting, 90 peasants living with HIV/AIDS were protesting in Beijing on the street, and they were just directly sent home, and no government officials were willing to talk to them. So the special treatment given to gay men were not because the country is less homophobic or the state is less homophobic. As one security official said in the interview, quote, homosexuals are not dangerous. As long as homosexuality is seen as deviation by the society, this group will not become a political threat by the state, quote. In 2013, the whole AIDS activist community became fragmented. Urban gay males took over the leadership and became the representative of AIDS movement at the transnational level. Peasants began to withdraw from the whole transnational engagement and became radicalized and isolated. Female sex workers, their groups mostly dissolved before they ever had a chance to involve into larger mobilization. So as a conclusion, I argue that external interventions accounted for both the decline of coercion and the innovation of diplomatic repression against AIDS activism. So what does that tell us in a more broader sense? Conceptually, my research departs from the traditional premise that conception of politics and domination in strong authoritarian regimes are defined by single polity. Recently, scholars have highlighted important questions. Why do some authoritarian regimes collapse while others don't? most studies tend to focus on domestic factors and consider different countries in relative isolation. We have heard about the Chinese characteristics, so and so with Chinese characters again, and again. So here I'm arguing that the resilience of authoritarian states cannot be understood independently. Instead, external challenges or globalization might ironically contribute to the sustainability and innovation of authoritarian rules. More specifically, this research contributes to three important theoretical discussions. First, many scholars have concluded that transnational institutions are ineffective in decreasing human rights abuse in authoritarian countries. So transnational institutions fail to matter in those countries. But instead, my argument is that I wanted to bring authoritarian repression back into the core theoretical debate by shifting the question from the quantity to the quality of repression. One could certainly view that external interventions have failed in my case. However, the reality is that transnational aid institutions actually have had a remarkable impact in China. They transformed the repressive practices by altering their objectives and the practices considered as appropriate in public health areas. Secondly, this study helps to flesh out dynamics that are typically ignored in international relations studies. Simply put, existing accounts tend to focus on the stylized assumptions about domestic compliance and resistance. So my model is going beyond this dichotomy and really highlights a nuanced set of processes that lie somewhere in between. It emphasizes that outcomes apart from the intended ones are actually of prime importance. Thirdly, my research showcased that international interventions are not always a story of neatly divided antagonists. With foreign entities on the one side, you have the 反华势力, then you have the national government on the other side. This research highlights that not only rivalry, but also complementarity, yes, between transnational and domestic organizations. So today's talk is a small piece of my book, which shows you one of many ways through which global health governance generates new forms of political conflict and inequality. For example, state repression was actually one of many factors contributing to the death of AIDS activism. My book shows that transnational institutions shifted the AIDS governance towards a model that is based on quantified data and managerial knowledge. And urban gay groups quickly learned how to make their experience and their identity useful for data collection and creating health indicators. But others failed to do so. They just couldn't fill the gap between the local political suffering and the new disease model based on measurement and counting. With that, thank you very much.
For questions? Are there two? There's two. I think we have 2 mics.
Thanks for that really fascinating talk. I know that you've been concentrating on the dynamics and interactions between these various actors, and I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about the impact on the lives of people suffering with HIV and AIDS. And specifically, I'm wondering, given that there is a focus and more resources going to groups of gay urban males, has there been any perhaps trickle-down effect that the benefits they're getting have in fact improved the situation for these underrepresented groups, or are they now just sort of irrevocably marginalized in contemporary AIDS activism? Thanks.
Should I collect all the questions or just answer?
It's up to you. We have time, so you can go one by one if you want.
Okay. So the first question about how they affect the lives of different groups, I would say in general it would be a success story. I think transnational interventions are very successful in terms of pushing AIDS governance as a valid policy area. So now we actually have AIDS governance in place. So that certainly benefit everybody. I would say that because of that, we had free treatment, the first line treatment. We had a much better care system. Infectious disease control itself as a whole certainly benefited from this process. So I would say yes, interventions worked in that sense. Secondly is about the trickle-down effect. Today's talk really didn't go into the health bureaucratic expansion, why it ended up. So the story about why gay men receive so much attention is really much more complicated. In a very simple way, AIDS governance in China had experienced transition from first focusing on treatment, then behavioral intervention, and then to testing. So the testing, the blood testing part was really when gay groups became the star, because they could just collect the data, the blood samples in the shortest period of time. And then treatment in the rural areas. Many of you probably know HIV/AIDS is a chronic disease. It requires intensive care on a daily basis. It's very expensive, and in terms of the metrics of health governance, it's actually much better if they just die, from the health bureaucrat's perspective. So there is a shift of policy attention towards how to calculate the political economy of intervention. So you would see that the health intervention in terms of HIV/AIDS has been expanded dramatically among gay groups, among gay population in general. But in the rural areas, they tend to have multiple treatment intervention in the same subgroup of people living with HIV/AIDS. I can't really delve into the detail, but that would be the two different models. So I would say yes, external interventions worked, but they have very differential effects on different communities. And it really depends on the interactions between those three sort of bodies or actors in my story. But is there a trickle down? I want to call it a trickling down. It's really a shift of focus, because peasants used to be the focus between 2005 and 2008, after the whole the behavioral intervention and then testing came into place. Yeah.
Hi, my question is actually a little bit more related to something I read about you that said you got a master's in sociology in Beijing and then a PhD in sociology in the United States. So I was just curious, in terms of some of the more social issues and things like homosexuality and ideas of that nature, how do the teaching at each country differ? Just curious kind of how they approach these kinds of topics.
That's really a much broader issue. I don't know if I have the expertise to really speak to that topic. So just based on my own experience, a little bit about my work. Okay, so it started as a project just about peasants. I expected myself to go to the rural areas. No, I ended up, the first year of my fieldwork, I got stuck in Beijing. Most of my research subjects were gay men. So honestly, I can only speak about my own personal experience, which is I didn't even know that we had gay men before that. So in my book, I did talk a lot about this taboo against homosexuality. So it's a subject that was not being governed to a certain extent. So the government has been pushing it out of its, as its object of governance, and how AIDS politics really changes the whole standards. So personally, yes, I came back from my fieldwork. I freaked out. I started to take courses on sexuality and about homosexual men in the U.S. context. So I'm not so sure if that answers your question, but I would say nowadays, I think the education system might be very different because the whole attitude and the visibility of homosexuality issues and its importance or its status to the whole government system had dramatically changed in the past decade. Yeah.
Thank you.
Honestly, I don't even know how the U.S. system works on that, so I can't really compare.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for this talk. It's really fascinating. I just had a question about the change in diplomatic coercion repression between Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
I was actually very surprised to see Li Keqiang talking to an HIV/AIDS activist group. I mean, there was so much fear about kind of a crackdown on civil society under Xi Jinping. So I was just wondering how things may have changed.
So first off, the meeting actually took place, it was in 2012.
Okay.
So the power wasn't consolidated, that's first. And then secondly, I would say, I think during the whole era, they really started to experiment different ways to engage with so-called global civil society. And also, there was a very dominant fear again about the Orange Revolution. That was something that was talked about again, and again. So this was a new issue for Hu. That was something he countered when he first came to power. So that became something very dominant. So in my book, I had the time to really talk about how the whole party system wasn't really sure about how to react to it. And I think at the time, China was certainly, it wasn't susceptible to external pressure, but it was really, it was still much, bigger concern compared to nowadays. So how to navigate the situation, how to respond to it had become a major issue for a long time. And the government wasn't sure about what to do between 2004 up to 2007. 2007 was really a turning point. So that's why HIV/AIDS was very interesting, because they started to experiment a lot of strategies in terms of what to do. You have this immediate, need. And I think nowadays, when you look at a lot of Xi's policy, I think this, I don't have data to support it, but I think a lot of experiment and practices that started off in the AIDS area or the health area were applied and expanded to other areas. So nowadays, you would see in the 一路一带 or 一带一路, there was a huge emphasis on NGOs, on the diplomacy. That had never ever happened before. So in 2007, when I was during my fieldwork, that was something very new. And because I also did a shadow comparison, I interviewed different NGOs in different sectors to figure out how unique AIDS was. And at the time, their interaction with the government, I also interviewed the government about how they, treated different activism. And NGO at the time was still much of a taboo for government officials to be familiar with or talk about. But nowadays, they feel much more comfortable. Yes, they should include NGOs. They're important. They're very good for the policy agenda overseas. So I think there is a learning process. That's really my research is about, is that the party really learn. And it would incorporate elements from overseas and integrate it into its own system and come up with something totally new. Yeah.
Question here. Thank you. So I study East German AIDS policy, and one of the things that happened there in the 80s was that, once officials started forming closer relationships with organizations, transnational organizations, and the WHO, was that a lot of people sensed a business opportunity, and there were efforts for a couple of years to break into the global market for AIDS educational materials.
Oh, wow.
Did you see anything like that in your work?
Yeah, can you be more specific about
Yeah,
that?
sure. I mean, there was already there's already sort of a major center for producing health models for use in classrooms and museums in Dresden. And so, once they started talking more about global AIDS prevention, gears started turning, and then a few people wanted to try and produce AIDS models for education and sell them abroad and make that a big East German export. So did you see any sort of the business side of any of these processes?
It's certainly a business. I mean, one of the things I want to emphasize is that it's not like foreign organizations were ignorant about what was going on in China. But China as a market was so important, not market in a political sense, in terms of how to showcase the success of certain governance model. So there was certainly a collaboration between China and the transnational entities. But I would say China was still considered as a learner, as a student in this process, a place where you can, showcase the successful models from other contexts. But I think that nowadays it's definitely changing. China has started move into the African, like, I won't say it's a market, it's still political sense, but you can see the competition between the CDC system, the US Center for Disease Control, and then the China system. So the US CDC official was telling me, like, Chinese used to come into our labs and, want to study everything. But nowadays, they are studying their own AIDS intervention programs in Africa. I think it was a couple years ago. So on the American side, there is certainly this kind of concern in terms of if China would become the next competitor. Because as you can see, China has started producing its own best practice in many, many ways. I think so far I haven't seen any success story in terms of, what they produce, but so far it's still sort of replication of success, best practice from other contexts. But I would say, yeah, in the future that's probably going to be the case. And it'll be very interesting to see how different countries are, enter into this market. Yeah, I would love to know more about, different country situation. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the fascinating talk. I wanted to ask questions about maybe two groups of actors that didn't get that much mentioned in your talk. One is, you mentioned very briefly that the kind of AIDS activism included three groups. One is female sex workers, but I wondered how they figured into the kind of community activism. And you seem to, in the brief mention, you seem to place them in the middle, like between gay men and HIV positive patients in terms of hierarchy. So how did that happen? That's one thing. And the other thing is that, so besides the kind of health social organizations that are basically promoted by the state, there seem to be another group of NGOs that are also incubating, like small NGOs at that time, that are like, for example, I was thinking of 爱之行 or later on 艺人品, things like that. So, I mean, of course, they both sort of were closed at this time, are closed now. But how did they figure into the kind of transnational and state interaction in the long period of the early 2000s?
Oh, wow, they're both big questions. Okay, the first question, actually female sex workers are on the bottom. So they never, this is the thing about female sex workers in my story, it has always been a shadow. So in the 1990s, when forming, especially like Ford or other US-based foundations started to conduct AIDS intervention in China, actually female sex workers were the first one they brought up. But at the time, Chinese activists, they have this conception of what AIDS activism should be about. And the US model had a huge influence on them. So they associated with gay activism and then AIDS altogether. So that was that time why female sex work didn't really draw a lot of attention. And also the Ministry of Health relationship, or homosexuality and heterosexuality are two very different things. The female sex workers have always been policed and controlled very closely by the state, versus, as I mentioned, urban gay men, they tend to be pushed out of the government system. Okay, so you have already had a system in place. When you wanted to change that, it's very difficult for health ministry to do. So it did try to sort of enter into that area, but it never succeeded. So in terms of the governance focus, female sex workers just had never ever been much of a focus. It never got, and also because the party had several sex cracking down kind of 扫黄, kind of cracking down campaign since early 90s. So this area just had never ever really started. So female sex workers began to conduct AIDS intervention and began their own AIDS group starting in 2006. So it was similar, a little bit later than gay men. But so it goes back to the intervention model. So AIDS intervention is all about the peer education, okay, peer groups. And the health department had a really difficult time reaching out to gay community. Nobody in the government would acknowledge they are gay men or whatever. So they would have this sense of you have to work with gay groups to reach that community. Versus in female sex work, that's not the case. That system already exists. You work with police to distribute condoms. So there was not much of incentive or motives, or it's very difficult for female sex workers to really navigate this system. So that's related to the technology of AIDS intervention and what kind of opportunities and space it offered, to local groups. So that's like sort of a short answer to the question. The second one, can you put it and frame it again,
These sort of more radical kind of activist groups and how they figured into the kind of transnational and state dynamics, because they also incubated smaller NGOs.
Yes, they were the one who started the whole incubating process. I don't really have time to get into it, but this is related to the international projects production. Okay, so Ai-Zhixing was actually the first one who started incubating NGOs. So their intention was to sort of promote human rights perspective. However, in terms of incubating NGO, there are many different models. And another model or another logic would be to distributing projects. Because you need to outsource your projects, you need organizations to make them happen on the ground. So in some sense, radical NGOs, when they create this whole system to distribute transnational funding, okay, from the US, for example, then they would distribute to smaller NGOs, and they would distribute to smaller NGOs on the ground. So this system, the problem is it was turned into a machine to generate certain project results. And it's also very vulnerable because all you need to do is to replace some of the umbrella NGOs. So yes, Ai-Zhixing was the radical one were under a lot of attack. So I don't have time to go into that, but Ministry of Health had created a lot of umbrella NGOs at the same time, so to compete against them. So as long as you can replace the head, you can pretty much control the whole network. So that is also one of the reasons why AIDS movement just declined just overnight. It was so fast. So part of it is the funding distribution network is really not the way to do social movement.
So we're out of time, so that's the last question, but I want to thank you for your great talk. Thanks.
Thank you very much.